Ethan Walker found out his parents had taken his antique guitar and sold it for $71,000 on the same afternoon he realized it was missing from the place he had trusted most. The sentence replayed in his mind with a dull, echoing weight as he stood alone in his apartment, staring at the empty wall hook where the guitar had hung for years, the outline still faintly visible like a ghost that refused to leave. To anyone else, it would have looked like just another instrument, old wood, worn strings, a relic from a different era, but to Ethan, it was a piece of his own timeline, a quiet witness to who he had been before life scattered him into obligations, compromises, and distance. The guitar had been built in the early 1950s, its finish aged to a deep honey brown, its tone warm and unmistakable, and it had come into his life not through money but through memory, through a man who once sat beside him on a back porch, teaching him chords while cicadas buzzed in the summer heat. Ethan had never locked it away or hidden it, because he never believed he needed to. When work required him to travel for several months, he left it at his parents' house, the same place where he had grown up, the same place where nothing had ever gone missing, the same place where he had been taught that family meant safety. The discovery came quietly, without drama, without shouting, without confrontation. A casual conversation with an old friend who dealt in vintage instruments turned into a pause, then a question, then a confirmation that made Ethan's stomach tighten. A rare guitar matching the exact description of his had been sold through a regional dealer 2 weeks earlier for $71,000. The serial number matched. The wear patterns matched. Even the small nick near the bridge, the one Ethan remembered from a night when his hand slipped during practice, matched perfectly. He didn't accuse anyone. He didn't call his parents in a rage. He sat down instead, letting the information settle, noticing how calm his breathing was, how steady his hands remained, and how something inside him quietly shifted. His parents, Robert and Linda Walker, had always believed they knew what was best for their son. They were practical people, the kind who saw objects in terms of usefulness and value, who believed sentimentality was something you outgrew once adulthood demanded results. In their minds, the guitar was sitting unused, collecting dust, a relic tied to a version of Ethan they assumed no longer existed. They had convinced themselves they were helping him, turning something old into something practical, something that could be measured, justified, and spent. What they never asked was whether it was theirs to decide. What they never imagined was that the guitar was more than an object, more than a line item on a sales receipt. As Ethan stood in the quiet of his apartment, the city noise muted through the windows, he didn't feel anger first. He felt clarity. The kind that arrives when a long, unspoken truth finally has a shape. He realized this wasn't just about money, or even about the guitar itself. It was about a boundary that had been crossed without hesitation, about a choice made in his absence, about a belief that his life was still something they could rearrange when he wasn't looking. And somewhere between the empty hook on the wall and the confirmation of that $71,000 sale, Ethan understood something his parents did not. They believed they had given something away, and gained cash in return. They had no idea what they had truly handed over, and they had no idea what that decision had already set in motion. Ethan did not confront his parents right away, because part of him wanted to understand how something like this had happened without a single conversation, without a warning, without even a message asking for permission. He replayed the past several months in his head, the timeline lining up with uncomfortable precision. When he had packed for his work assignment, he remembered carefully placing the guitar back in its hard case, wiping the strings down, and setting it in the corner of the spare room at his parents' house. Robert had watched him do it, nodding absently, already talking about the weather and traffic, as if the object itself barely registered. Linda had smiled and said it would be safe there, the way she always did, with a confidence that discouraged further discussion. Ethan had believed her because he always had. Growing up, that house had been a place where nothing important was ever questioned, only managed. His parents managed schedules, finances, expectations, and eventually, they managed him. Even as an adult, even after he moved out, that pattern never fully disappeared. Sitting at his kitchen table now, Ethan opened his laptop and reviewed the email his friend had forwarded him, the one confirming the sale. The language was formal, clean, and final, listing the condition of the instrument, the year it was built, and the final price paid by the buyer. $71,000. The number looked unreal on the screen, not because it was high, but because it reduced something deeply personal into a neat figure with 2 decimal places. He imagined his parents at the dealer's office, polite, composed, convinced they were doing the responsible thing. He could already hear his mother's voice, calm and reasonable, explaining that the guitar belonged to the family, that it had been sitting unused, that it was better this way. Linda had always believed that practicality outweighed sentiment, especially when sentiment made her uncomfortable. Robert would have agreed, likely adding that Ethan was too busy to notice, that he would understand eventually, that this was just another grown-up decision made on his behalf. Ethan thought back to childhood moments that suddenly felt different in hindsight. Times when decisions had been made without him, schools chosen, hobbies dropped, paths redirected, because they were deemed impractical or unnecessary. Back then, he had accepted it as guidance. Now, it felt like something else entirely. The guitar was never just an instrument. It had been the one constant he returned to when everything else felt uncertain. Late nights practicing alone, weekends playing small gigs for almost no money, moments when music made sense of feelings he could not explain out loud. Even after life pushed him into a more stable career, he never let go of it. Leaving it with his parents had not been a mistake in his mind, because trust had never felt like a risk before. As the evening stretched on, Ethan did something that surprised even him. He did not call. He did not send a message. He simply closed his laptop and sat quietly, letting the realization settle that this was not an isolated incident, but a pattern reaching its natural conclusion. His parents had not stolen out of desperation or cruelty. They had taken something because they believed they had the right to decide its value and by extension, his. The sale was not an accident. It was the result of a belief that his life was still an extension of theirs, something to be adjusted when convenient. That understanding brought a strange sense of calm. There was grief, yes, but it was muted, replaced by a sharper awareness. Whatever conversation came next would not be about money, or even about the guitar. It would be about ownership, autonomy, and the quiet line that had been crossed without anyone thinking to ask whether it should have been crossed at all. Ethan decided to see his parents in person rather than let the conversation unfold through a screen, because some truths revealed more in body language than in words, and he wanted to observe, not argue. 2 days later, he drove the familiar route to the house where he had grown up, noticing details he had ignored for years, the freshly trimmed lawn, the new mailbox, the subtle signs of control and order that mirrored the way Robert and Linda lived their lives. When he stepped inside, nothing seemed out of place, which only made the absence of the guitar feel louder in his mind. The spare room door was open, the corner where the case had rested now occupied by a small storage shelf, as if the space had been intentionally repurposed to erase any reminder of what had been there before. Linda greeted him with a warm smile and an easy hug, asking about his trip and offering coffee, her tone relaxed, untroubled, almost rehearsed. Robert followed shortly after, nodding in greeting, already discussing practical matters like gas prices and road construction, as if keeping the conversation grounded would prevent it from drifting toward anything uncomfortable. Ethan let them talk. He listened more than he spoke, noting how neither of them mentioned the guitar, how carefully they avoided the spare room, how normal everything was made to feel. When the moment finally came, it was unremarkable. Ethan mentioned the instrument casually, the way one might bring up a misplaced tool, or a missing book. He said he had been looking for it and asked if they remembered where it was. Linda did not answer immediately. She glanced at Robert, who cleared his throat before speaking, his voice steady but slightly forced. He explained that they had taken care of it while Ethan was away, that they had made a decision they believed was sensible, that the guitar had been sold to someone who would appreciate it. Linda stepped in quickly, adding that they had assumed Ethan would be relieved, that he was busy now, that he had not played in years, that it was better to turn something unused into something useful. There was no apology in her words, only justification. Ethan watched their faces carefully, the way they framed the situation as a favor, the way they positioned themselves as caretakers rather than intruders. When he asked about the price, Linda hesitated for just a fraction of a second before answering. She said the amount confidently, as if it were proof that they had done well, that they had acted wisely. $71,000. Robert nodded in agreement, adding that it was a good deal, that they had consulted someone knowledgeable, that they had protected the family's interests. Ethan thanked them for telling him. The words came out calm and even, surprising everyone in the room. He did not raise his voice or challenge their reasoning. Instead, he asked where the money was now. Linda explained that it was being held temporarily, that they were considering the best way to use it, that some of it could help with household expenses, that some could be set aside for him if he needed it later. The phrasing was careful, measured, and revealing. In that moment, Ethan understood that the transaction had never truly been about the guitar. It had been about control, about deciding what mattered and who got to decide it. He realized that his parents genuinely believed they had acted responsibly, that they had improved the situation, that his role in the decision was optional. As the conversation wound down, Ethan stood and prepared to leave. Linda looked slightly unsettled now, as if his lack of reaction had unsettled her more than anger would have. She asked if he was upset, if he wanted to talk more, if everything was all right. Ethan assured her he was fine. He said he just needed time to think. As he drove away, he felt a strange sense of distance settle in, not physical, but emotional, like a door quietly closing without a sound. He knew then that whatever came next would not be impulsive or loud. It would be deliberate. His parents believed the matter was settled, that the value had been exchanged and the chapter closed. They did not yet realize that Ethan was only beginning to understand the full scope of what had been taken from him, and more importantly, what that decision would ultimately cost them. Ethan did not rush into action after leaving his parents' house, because haste would have given them exactly what they expected, an emotional reaction they could frame as immaturity or misunderstanding. Instead, he returned to his apartment and began doing something he had learned to do well over the years, observing patterns and filling in gaps. He replayed every detail of the conversation, the timing of their words, the confidence with which they spoke about the sale, and the casual way they discussed the money as if it were already absorbed into their household. That confidence told him this decision had not been impulsive. It had been planned, discussed, and justified long before he ever found out. The next morning, Ethan reached out to the dealer through a professional inquiry, presenting himself not as an aggrieved son, but as a collector seeking information. The response came back quickly, polite and thorough, confirming the transaction date, the condition report, and the fact that the sellers had provided documentation claiming clear ownership. That detail caught his attention. Clear ownership. Ethan knew exactly what paperwork existed for the guitar, because he had been the one to safeguard it for years. There were letters, appraisals, and a handwritten note from the original owner that established provenance in a way few instruments ever had. Those documents had been stored separately, in a fireproof box that had never left his apartment. His parents had sold the guitar without them. That meant something important. As Ethan continued his quiet inquiry, he learned that the buyer was not just a casual musician, but a private collector with a reputation for acquiring historically significant instruments, and, when possible, tracing their full background. The sale price suddenly made more sense. Without the complete documentation, the guitar had been undervalued, sold as an exceptional instrument, but not yet recognized for everything it represented. Ethan realized that his parents believed they had made a smart deal, but in reality, they had settled for a fraction of its true worth. More importantly, they had transferred something they did not fully understand. Over the next few days, Ethan reviewed old emails, scanned photographs, and records he had kept out of habit rather than expectation. He noticed how often his parents had framed their involvement in his life as support while quietly making decisions on his behalf. The guitar was simply the most visible example. As this understanding settled in, Ethan felt neither satisfaction nor rage. He felt resolve. The situation no longer felt personal in the way it once had. It felt procedural. His parents had acted under the assumption that their authority still extended into his adulthood, that his possessions were communal by default, and that any objection would eventually fade. They had not anticipated that Ethan would respond by stepping outside the emotional script they knew so well. One evening, his mother called to check in, her voice light, almost cheerful, as if the matter were already behind them. She mentioned household updates, upcoming plans, and casually referenced the money again, suggesting ways it could be used responsibly. Ethan listened and responded politely, offering non-committal answers, careful not to reveal how much he now understood. When the call ended, he sat quietly for a long moment, recognizing the shift that had taken place. The balance of information had changed. His parents believed the situation was under control, that their explanation had been accepted, and that time would smooth over any lingering discomfort. They did not know that Ethan now saw the situation more clearly than they did, not just what had been taken, but how it had been taken, and what that revealed about their view of him. He understood that the next steps would require patience and precision. Any move made too early would be dismissed or minimized. Any move made emotionally would be reframed. What mattered now was timing. As Ethan prepared for what came next, he felt a quiet certainty settle in. His parents had believed they were managing an asset. They had believed they were closing a chapter. They had no idea that, by acting without consent and without full understanding, they had opened a process that would redefine their relationship with their son in ways they could not yet see, and once that process was complete, there would be no returning to the assumptions they had relied on for decades. Ethan waited another week before taking any visible step, because patience was no longer restraint but leverage. During that time, he continued gathering clarity rather than evidence, not to build a case against his parents in a legal sense, but to understand exactly how far their assumptions extended. He reviewed the documents he had kept for years, the appraisal letters, the correspondence with collectors, the handwritten note from the original owner describing the guitar's history, and how it had passed through careful hands before reaching Ethan. Reading it again, he realized how deliberately he had separated sentiment from responsibility, how he had protected the guitar not as an heirloom to be worshipped, but as a trust to be honored. That trust had never included his parents. The more Ethan examined the situation, the clearer one truth became. Robert and Linda had not acted out of malice. They had acted out of certainty. They were certain they knew what mattered, certain they understood value, and certain that Ethan would eventually align with their reasoning if given enough time. That certainty was what made the situation irreversible. One afternoon, Ethan received another message from the dealer, informing him that the buyer had requested additional information about the instrument's background and provenance. The inquiry was polite, but specific, asking whether any documentation existed beyond what had been provided at the time of sale. Ethan read the message slowly, recognizing the opening it represented. The buyer was beginning to realize there was more to the guitar than its surface condition and tone. Ethan responded carefully, confirming that documentation did exist, and that he was the original custodian of the instrument. He did not accuse his parents, or imply wrongdoing. He simply stated facts, the way he had learned to do in professional settings where emotion complicated outcomes. The response from the buyer came later that evening, measured and curious, expressing interest in speaking further. For the first time since discovering the sale, Ethan felt the balance shift in a tangible way. His parents still believed the transaction was complete, that the value had been finalized and the matter settled. They continued to act as though the money belonged to them collectively, occasionally mentioning future plans, repairs, or expenses that could be managed more comfortably now. Ethan did not challenge these comments. He let them stand, understanding that every assumption they made only reinforced the framework they were operating within. When he visited again, the atmosphere felt relaxed, almost celebratory. Linda spoke openly about the relief of having extra funds, about how responsible the decision had been, about how fortunate it was that the guitar had been sold at the right time. Robert nodded along, reinforcing the narrative with practical reasoning. Ethan listened, responding with calm acknowledgement, asking neutral questions, offering no resistance. His composure seemed to reassure them. They mistook his silence for acceptance. What they did not see was how completely his perspective had shifted. Ethan no longer viewed the situation as a conflict between family members. He saw it as a clear misalignment of authority and consent. The guitar had been a boundary they crossed, because they believed boundaries no longer applied. That belief extended beyond property. It shaped how they viewed his independence, his decisions, and his adulthood. Recognizing this removed the last trace of doubt from his mind. Later that night, alone again, Ethan reflected on how easily his parents had justified their actions to themselves. They had framed the sale as practical, even generous, convincing themselves they were acting in his best interest. They had not considered the possibility that their version of help was no longer welcome. They had not considered that the true value of what they sold was not monetary at all. As Ethan prepared for the next phase, he felt neither anticipation nor anxiety. He felt prepared. His parents believed the chapter had closed neatly, with money in the bank and no visible consequences. They did not yet understand that the situation was still unfolding, guided not by anger or revenge, but by a quiet insistence on ownership, truth, and the right to decide one's life without interference. And once that insistence took form, it would not be something they could talk their way out of. Ethan scheduled the call with the buyer 2 days later, choosing a time when he knew he would be uninterrupted, because this was not a conversation he wanted rushed or clouded by distraction. The collector introduced himself calmly, speaking with the careful enthusiasm of someone who understood both the market and the responsibility that came with rare instruments. He explained that after the purchase, certain details about the guitar had raised questions, not concerns, but curiosities that suggested a deeper history than initially presented. Ethan listened closely, confirming what the man suspected without embellishment, explaining that the guitar had been in his possession for years, and that its documentation existed independently of the sale. He described the handwritten note, the early appraisals, and the chain of custody that tied the instrument to a small, but respected circle of musicians and collectors. The tone of the call remained professional, but beneath it, a quiet recalibration was taking place. The buyer acknowledged that the guitar's historical and provenance value could significantly exceed what had been paid, especially if the documentation verified what Ethan described. He asked, carefully, how the instrument had come to be sold without Ethan's involvement. Ethan did not offer personal details. He stated simply that the sale had occurred without his consent, and that he was in the process of clarifying ownership. The buyer responded with understanding rather than alarm, explaining that transactions of this nature sometimes carried complications, and that he was willing to proceed transparently. When the call ended, Ethan sat back, aware that something essential had shifted. For the first time, the reality of the situation extended beyond the walls of his parents' house. The assumption that they had closed the matter no longer held. Meanwhile, Robert and Linda continued their routine, increasingly comfortable in the belief that everything had settled. Linda mentioned upcoming expenses more freely now, speaking about renovations and long-delayed upgrades, as if the funds were already mentally allocated. Robert discussed investments and savings, framing the sale as a prudent move that had strengthened their financial footing. Their confidence was steady, almost reassuring, because it rested on a simple idea. They believed authority flowed naturally from parent to child, regardless of age. That belief had guided them for decades, and they saw no reason to question it now. Ethan noticed how easily they spoke of the money as communal, how instinctively they excluded him from any final decision while still presenting the outcome as beneficial to him. The contrast between their certainty and the reality unfolding beyond their awareness was striking. Ethan did not correct them. He continued to respond with calm neutrality, offering neither agreement nor objection. Each interaction reinforced the same conclusion. They did not see him as an independent party in this matter. They saw him as someone who would eventually fall in line once the reasoning was explained enough times. As days passed, Ethan prepared quietly, organizing his documentation, reviewing correspondence, and considering his options with a clear head. This was not about confrontation. It was about alignment. The situation had exposed a fundamental mismatch between how his parents viewed their role and how he viewed his life. The guitar had simply been the catalyst. What mattered now was establishing a boundary that could not be reinterpreted or softened with familiar language. One evening, Linda called again, her tone casual, asking if Ethan had thought more about the sale, and whether he felt relieved knowing the guitar had gone to a good home. Ethan replied evenly, saying he was still processing everything. That answer seemed to satisfy her. She assumed time would do the rest. After the call, Ethan reflected on how predictably his parents relied on patience as a tool of control, believing that if they waited long enough, resistance would dissolve. What they did not understand was that Ethan was no longer reacting from emotion. He was acting from clarity. The path forward was becoming unmistakable. The buyer's questions, the missing documentation, and the assumptions his parents continued to make were converging into a single point of resolution. Whatever came next would not be dramatic or loud. It would be precise. And once it unfolded, there would be no space left for reinterpretation, because the facts would speak more clearly than any family narrative ever had. Ethan felt the situation tighten in a way that was subtle but unmistakable, like a knot being pulled slowly rather than yanked, as the buyer followed up with a request that changed the tone of everything. The collector asked if Ethan would be willing to share copies of the documentation he mentioned, not to challenge the sale, but to better understand the instrument he now possessed. Ethan agreed, knowing that transparency here was not a risk but a lever. He sent scanned copies of the appraisal letters, the handwritten note from the original owner, and photographs showing the guitar's history over several decades, each detail reinforcing that this was not merely a valuable instrument, but one with a traceable and respected lineage. The response from the buyer was immediate, and markedly different from previous messages. The collector expressed surprise at the depth of the guitar's background and admitted that with this level of provenance, the instrument's market value would likely be far higher than the price paid. He explained that such documentation could place the guitar into a different category entirely, one that appealed to museums, institutions, and elite collectors rather than private enthusiasts alone. Ethan read the message carefully, absorbing the confirmation of what he had already suspected. His parents had sold something they did not fully understand, and in doing so, they had undervalued it in more ways than one. The buyer went on to explain that the documentation raised questions about rightful authority in the sale, not in an accusatory way, but as a matter of due diligence. Ethan responded with calm precision, reiterating that he had never authorized the transaction, and that the guitar had been left in his parents' care temporarily. The exchange remained professional, but the implications were clear. The sale was no longer a closed chapter. While this conversation unfolded quietly, Robert and Linda remained unaware of how the narrative was shifting. They continued to speak about the sale as a success story, occasionally referencing how fortunate it was that Ethan had not needed the guitar anymore. Linda even suggested that the buyer should be grateful, framing the situation as though everyone had benefited. Their confidence was rooted in a simple belief that money settled disputes and that time softened boundaries. Ethan recognized how deeply they relied on that belief. It had worked for them in the past. It would not work now. As days passed, the buyer informed Ethan that he was consulting legal advisors to ensure the acquisition was properly validated, not out of hostility, but to protect his own interests. This step alone reframed the entire situation. What had begun as a private family matter was now intersecting with professional standards that did not bend to parental authority or personal justifications. Ethan did not initiate any confrontation with his parents during this time. He allowed them to continue under the assumption that everything remained as they understood it. This distance gave him clarity rather than doubt. He realized that the most revealing aspect of the situation was not the sale itself, but how his parents reacted to the idea of ownership. They had spoken as though his possessions were extensions of their household, subject to their judgment even in his absence. That assumption had never been challenged directly before. Now it was being examined under conditions they could not control. When Ethan visited again, Linda mentioned the buyer casually, remarking that he seemed pleasant and that it was good the guitar had gone to someone responsible. Ethan agreed politely, offering no additional information. Robert talked about how situations like this proved the value of being decisive, implying that hesitation only complicated things. Ethan listened, noting how confidently they reinforced their own narrative. It was clear they believed the story had ended in their favor. Later that evening, alone once more, Ethan reflected on how little his parents knew about what was unfolding. They believed they had traded an object for money and moved on. They did not see that the guitar's true worth extended beyond its sale price, nor did they understand that authority did not automatically transfer with age or proximity. The buyer's growing awareness, the missing documentation, and the questions of consent were converging into something unavoidable. Ethan felt no urge to rush. The process was doing what it needed to do on its own. His parents had assumed they gave something away, and gained security in return. In reality, they had exposed a boundary they never expected to be enforced, and once that boundary was acknowledged by others outside the family, it would not be something they could explain away with confidence or familiarity. The quiet certainty Ethan felt now was not satisfaction, but readiness. The truth was no longer confined to his understanding alone, and when it fully surfaced, it would do so without anger, without accusation, and without the possibility of being dismissed. Ethan understood that the next phase would unfold without his parents being invited into it, because their involvement would only distort the clarity that had finally emerged. The buyer informed him that legal counsel had reviewed the documentation and confirmed that the absence of consent and provenance disclosure introduced serious questions about the legitimacy of the sale. The tone remained calm and procedural, but the implication was unmistakable. The transaction could not simply be treated as final. Ethan responded with the same restraint he had maintained throughout, providing what was requested, clarifying timelines, and avoiding any language that framed the situation as a family dispute. To him, it was no longer about emotion. It was about alignment with reality. As this process moved forward, the buyer proposed a temporary hold on any further transfer or display of the guitar until the matter was resolved. This decision shifted the pressure away from Ethan and toward the assumptions his parents had relied on. Meanwhile, Robert and Linda continued their routines, unaware that the certainty they felt was beginning to erode beyond their view. They spoke of the money as if it were already integrated into their future, discussing plans with an ease that suggested the past could not reach them. Linda mentioned improvements to the house, framing them as sensible investments. Robert talked about stability, about how they had finally made a decision that reflected foresight rather than nostalgia. Ethan listened when these topics surfaced, offering polite responses, never contradicting them directly. Their confidence depended on his silence, and he allowed it to remain intact. Internally, however, something had shifted decisively. Ethan recognized that the most effective response was not confrontation, but consequence. The buyer's advisors requested a formal statement from Ethan regarding custody and consent, and he provided it without embellishment. Each sentence was measured, factual, and complete. There were no accusations, no emotional appeals, only a clear account of how the guitar had been left in temporary care and sold without authorization. This document became the anchor point around which everything else would turn. When Linda called to ask whether Ethan had heard back from the buyer, her voice carried an undertone of expectation, as if reassurance was owed. Ethan replied that the situation was being reviewed. He did not elaborate. The pause on the other end of the line was brief but telling. For the first time, uncertainty entered her tone. Robert followed up days later, asking practical questions about whether everything was settled and whether there was anything they needed to do. Ethan answered simply that processes were ongoing. He offered no comfort. This was not punishment. It was accuracy. As the weeks progressed, the buyer indicated that a resolution would require either formal acknowledgement of improper authorization or a restructuring of the transaction that reflected true ownership and value. Ethan did not push for a specific outcome. He allowed the process to reveal its own conclusions. His parents, meanwhile, began to sense that something was not aligning as expected. Their conversations grew more cautious. Linda asked whether the documentation Ethan mentioned had caused complications. Robert suggested that these matters were often overblown and would likely resolve themselves. Ethan did not correct them. He observed how quickly confidence gave way to concern when authority was no longer assumed. One evening, after another careful conversation, Ethan sat alone and reflected on how little this moment resembled the conflict he once imagined. There was no shouting, no dramatic confrontation, no declarations of betrayal. There was only the steady exposure of a belief system that no longer functioned under scrutiny. His parents had believed their role granted them permanent discretion. They were discovering, slowly and uncomfortably, that discretion required consent. The buyer's advisors scheduled a final review, and Ethan prepared accordingly, knowing that whatever outcome emerged would redefine the boundaries that had been ignored for years. He felt no triumph in this, only a quiet resolve. The guitar had set this in motion, but the outcome would extend far beyond it. When the truth finally settled into place, it would do so without spectacle, leaving behind a new reality that could not be negotiated away with familiarity or habit. Ethan understood now that the most lasting changes often arrived without noise, and once they arrived, they reshaped everything that followed. Ethan received the final update on a quiet morning, the kind that felt ordinary enough to disguise how much it would change. The buyer's advisors confirmed that the sale could not stand as it had occurred, given the lack of authorization and the newly established provenance. The resolution they proposed was measured and definitive. Ownership would be formally recognized as Ethan's, and the transaction would be restructured accordingly, reflecting the full documented value of the instrument rather than the compromised figure originally agreed upon. The buyer expressed respect for how Ethan had handled the situation and acknowledged that without his restraint and clarity, the truth might never have surfaced. Ethan accepted the resolution without celebration or resentment. It was simply the correct outcome. When he informed his parents, he did so without accusation, stating only that the matter had been reviewed and corrected based on ownership and documentation. The silence that followed was heavy, not with anger, but with realization. Linda struggled to respond at first, her voice losing the certainty it once carried. She asked how this could have happened, how something they believed was settled could be reopened so completely. Ethan answered calmly, explaining that assumptions did not override consent and that value was not defined solely by money. Robert reacted more quietly, his practical confidence giving way to a restrained acknowledgement that they might have misunderstood their authority. Neither argued. There was nothing left to argue against. The facts had done the work. In the weeks that followed, the money they had spoken about so freely was no longer theirs to plan around. The future they had imagined shifted subtly but permanently. Conversations became more careful, less declarative. When Ethan visited, there was a noticeable restraint in how decisions were discussed, an unspoken awareness that his life was no longer something to be managed. The guitar itself was returned to Ethan under circumstances that felt almost ceremonial in their simplicity. When he opened the case again, he noticed that nothing about the instrument had changed, yet everything around it had. It was not just a possession reclaimed. It was a boundary restored. Ethan did not dwell on what had been lost in the process. He understood that relationships evolve not through confrontation alone, but through moments when assumptions fail. His parents had believed they were acting responsibly, and now they were forced to confront the limits of that belief. There were no dramatic apologies, no emotional reconciliations. There was only a quiet adjustment to a new reality, one where Ethan's autonomy was no longer theoretical. Over time, communication settled into a different rhythm. Linda asked before making suggestions. Robert framed his opinions as just that, opinions rather than directives. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Ethan did not demand it. He did not announce it. It emerged naturally from the outcome they could not undo. Looking back, Ethan understood that the true cost of the decision his parents made was not financial. It was the loss of unquestioned authority, the realization that good intentions did not grant unlimited rights. The guitar had revealed a truth that words alone never could. By acting without consent, his parents had forced a reckoning that redefined their relationship with their son. Ethan carried that understanding forward without bitterness. He had learned that calm persistence could accomplish what anger never would, and that sometimes the most profound changes occurred not through conflict, but through clarity. The matter was resolved, not because someone had won, but because reality had finally been acknowledged. And in that acknowledgement, a new balance had been set, one that would shape every interaction that followed, quietly and permanently.